The pristine black leather of Kwan's driver's seat crinkled as he began to slide inside. His mind was already at the docks, calculating the interest on a debt owed by a man who didn't have much longer to live. Then, his phone buzzed, a frantic, distorted audio file from an unknown number. He pressed play. "Help Simeon, come and get me, he has locked me in the house." The voice was ragged, trembling with a terror that sliced through Kwan's icy composure. It was Simeon's phone, but it was Zoe's voice. His Zoe. The woman he had watched from the shadows for months, the one he had claimed in his mind long before she even knew his name. Kwan didn't think, he dialed the number back instantly. His grip on the steering wheel was so tight the leather groaned. "Who is this?" he barked, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "Hello," a child's voice whispered, small and frightened. "The lady next door. She used my phone. She said don't call the police. She said her brother Simeon is coming." "Where is she?" Kwan demanded, his eyes darkening to obsidian. "Inside the big house. Mr. William locked the doors. She told me. She told me not to call 911 because Mr. William's daddy is a policeman." Kwan's jaw tightened. A cop's son, a man who thought he was untouchable. He hung up, his tires screaming against the pavement as he roared out of the driveway. Simeon wasn't coming, but the king of the Seoul underground was. Zoe pressed her back against the heavy oak door of the bedroom, her breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. The click of the deadbolt echoed in the hallway like a gunshot. "Zoe, baby, open the door." William's voice was sickeningly calm, the sound of a man who knew he held all the cards. "You're being dramatic. I'm doing this for your own good. You're too beautiful to be out there in that world." "Let me out, William," she screamed, her voice cracking. She looked at the window, but they were third-story panes, reinforced and bolted shut. She had managed to slip the neighbor's daughter a note through the fence earlier, begging to use her phone. She had called Simeon, but she knew her brother was hours away. She hadn't meant to call the other number, the one she had memorized from a business card she'd found tucked into her purse weeks ago. A card belonging to a man named Kwan who looked at her with such terrifying intensity she felt like she was melting. The door handle rattled violently. "My father is the precinct captain, Zoe," William reminded her, his shadow blocking the light under the door. "No one is coming for you, no one would dare." Zoe sank to the floor, clutching her knees. She had traded one nightmare for another, but as the wood began to splinter under William's shoulder, she prayed to a god she hadn't spoken to in years that the monster she'd called was faster than the one outside her door. The iron gates of the estate didn't stand a chance against the grille of Kwan's SUV. He didn't wait for his men. He didn't need a tactical plan. The obsession that burned in his chest for Zoe was a fuel more volatile than any gasoline. He stepped out of the car before it had even fully stopped, a suppressed Glock 17 heavy in his hand. He didn't care about William's father. He didn't care about the badge. In his world, the only law was his word, and his word was that Zoe belonged to him. He reached the front door and didn't bother with the lock. Two well-placed kicks shattered the frame. The house was silent for a heartbeat before a scream erupted from upstairs. "Zoe." Kwan took the stairs 3 at a time, his heart thudding a rhythmic mine, mine, mine. He turned the corner just as William was raising a heavy lamp to bash in the bedroom door. "Put it down," Kwan said. It wasn't a shout. It was a cold, soul-stripping command that made the air in the hallway turn to ice. William spun around, his face pale. "Who the hell are you? My father is." Kwan was across the hall in a flash, his hand closing around William's throat with the strength of a hydraulic press. He shoved the younger man against the wall, the muzzle of the gun pressed hard under William's chin. "I don't care who your father is," Kwan whispered, his eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger. "I care that you touched what is mine." Inside the bedroom, Zoe heard the sickening thud of a body hitting the drywall. The shouting had stopped, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like it was crushing the lungs right out of her chest. Then she heard the lock turn. She scrambled backward on the carpet, her eyes wide, expecting William's enraged face. Instead, the door swung open to reveal a silhouette that stole the very air from the room. "Kwan." He stood in the doorway, his charcoal suit pristine despite the violence he'd just meted out. His chest rose and fell in slow, controlled heaves. He didn't look at the room, he looked only at her. His gaze swept over her messy hair, her tear-stained face, and the bruise blooming on her wrist where William had grabbed her earlier. "Kwan," she whispered, her voice trembling. He moved toward her with the fluid grace of a panther. Before she could stand, he was on one knee in front of her. He didn't ask if she was okay, he already knew she wasn't. He reached out, his large, calloused hand cupping her jaw with a tenderness that felt almost more dangerous than his anger. "I told you once, Zoe," he murmured, his thumb brushing over her lower lip. "If you ever needed me, you only had to breathe my name. You did better, you called." Kwan's eyes flickered to the hallway where William lay groaning, clutching a throat that would likely never speak clearly again. The dark heat in Kwan's gaze intensified. "Stay here," Kwan commanded. It wasn't a request, it was an anchor. He stood and walked back into the hall. Zoe watched from the floor, paralyzed. She saw Kwan look down at William like he was a piece of filth stuck to the bottom of his shoe. "My father, he'll kill you," William wheezed, his face a mottled purple. "He's the law." Kwan tilted his head, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, a cold, terrifying expression. "I am the law in this city, boy. Your father collects a paycheck from the city. I own the city." Kwan reached down and grabbed William by the collar, dragging him toward the stairs. The sound of William's body thumping against each step echoed through the house. Zoe finally found her feet, her legs shaking. She walked to the doorway and saw Kwan's men, 4 of them in dark suits, entering the foyer. They didn't say a word, they simply took William from Kwan's grip. "Dispose of the trash," Kwan ordered. "And find the father. Tell him his son had a very unfortunate accident involving a lapse in judgment." Kwan turned back to the stairs, his focus returning to Zoe. She was standing at the top, looking small and fragile in her oversized sweater. The sight of her sparked a possessive fire in his gut that he no longer cared to extinguish. He walked back up, stopping only inches from her. The scent of his expensive cologne, sandalwood and cold rain, wrapped around her. "He's gone," Kwan said, his voice dropping an octave. "He will never see the sun again, let alone you." Zoe looked up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. You can't just take me, my brother." "Your brother is a good man, Zoe. But he is a civilian," Kwan interrupted, stepping into her personal space until she was forced to lean back against the railing. "He couldn't protect you from a man like that. I can. I have been protecting you for months. Who do you think paid your mother's hospital bills? Who do you think scared off the landlord when he tried to hike your rent?" Zoe's eyes went wide. "That was you." "Everything is me," he whispered, his hand sliding into her hair, gripping just tight enough to make her gasp. "You are the only thing in this world I cannot control, and it is driving me insane." He didn't give her time to process. Kwan wrapped an arm around her waist and hoisted her against his side, walking her down the stairs. "I have to get my things," she protested feebly, though the feeling of his solid, warm body against hers was the only thing keeping her upright. "I will buy you a new life," Kwan said. "Everything in this house is tainted by him, you will leave it all behind." They stepped out into the night air. The flashing lights of a distant patrol car flickered in the valley, but Kwan didn't even flinch. He led her to the back of his armored SUV, sliding her into the plush interior before climbing in beside her. As the door closed, the world outside vanished. The cabin was silent, darkened, and smelled of him. Zoe huddled in the corner of the seat, the adrenaline finally fading and leaving a hollow ache behind. She began to shiver. Without a word, Kwan pulled her across the seat and onto his lap. He wrapped his heavy wool coat around her, pinning her against his chest. He was a mountain of muscle and suppressed violence, but in this moment he was her only shield. "You're safe," he muttered into her hair, "but you're mine now, Zoe, there is no going back." The car climbed the winding roads toward the penthouse district, eventually pulling into a private, underground garage. Security guards stood at every entrance, bowing their heads as the SUV passed. Kwan carried her from the car to a private elevator. Zoe was too exhausted to fight, her head resting on his shoulder. When the doors opened, she was greeted by a sprawling expanse of glass, marble, and steel. The entire city of Seoul sparkled below them like a carpet of diamonds. "This is your home now," Kwan said, setting her on her feet in the center of the living room. He walked to a sleek black console and pressed a button. Floor-to-ceiling shutters began to roll down, sealing the glass. The apartment became a tomb, a luxurious high-tech fortress. He turned back to her, unbuttoning his cuffs. The civilized veneer was slipping, replaced by the raw hunger of a man who had finally captured his prize. "You must be hungry," he said, his eyes roaming over her body. "Or perhaps you need a bath to wash his touch off your skin." Zoe looked at the heavy steel shutters. She was safe from William. She was safe from the police. But as Kwan stepped toward her, his eyes dark with an obsession that burned brighter than any city light, she realized she was now trapped with the most dangerous man of all. The bathroom was a cavern of black marble and heated stone. Kwan turned the handles on the oversized soaking tub, the roar of the water filling the silence between them. He didn't leave. He stood by the vanity, watching her through the steam. "Strip," he commanded softly. Zoe flinched, her fingers trembling at the hem of her sweater. "Kwan, I can do it myself." "He touched you," Kwan said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating low. He crossed the room, his presence looming over her until she was backed against the marble edge of the tub. Every inch of skin he laid eyes on, every place he gripped, "It's a stain on what belongs to me. I'm going to wash it away." He didn't wait for her consent. His large hands reached out, deftly pulling the sweater over her head. He moved with a clinical precision that masked the underlying fire in his eyes. When she stood before him in only her lace undergarments, his breath hitched. The obsession wasn't just in his mind anymore, it was written in the way his muscles locked. He lifted her into the water, the heat making her gasp. With a sponge and expensive oils, he began to scrub her skin. It wasn't gentle, but it wasn't cruel. It was thorough. He was erasing William one stroke at a time. As the water cooled, Kwan lifted her out, wrapping her in a towel so thick it felt like armor. He carried her into the primary suite, where a bed the size of a small island waited. He sat her on the edge and knelt between her knees, his hands resting on her thighs. "Why me?" Zoe whispered, her voice finally finding its strength. "You could have anyone, why spend months watching me? Why pay my bills?" Kwan's eyes tracked the movement of her throat as she swallowed. "Because you were the only thing that didn't look at me and see a monster or a paycheck. You looked at the world with a light that I needed to own. I tried to stay away, Zoe, truly." He leaned in, his lips inches from the pulse point at her neck. "But then I saw him hurting you, and the thought of anyone else's hands on you made me want to burn this city to the ground." He pressed a kiss to her collarbone, his teeth grazing the skin just enough to leave a faint, red mark. "Now the city knows, and you are the queen of a kingdom built on blood." The air in the room shifted from protective to predatory. Kwan stood, shedding his shirt to reveal a torso mapped in scars and intricate ink, dragons and tigers that seemed to writhe in the dim light. He was beautiful and terrifying, a god of the underworld. He pulled her up from the bed, his mouth crashing down onto hers. It wasn't a question, it was a demand. The kiss tasted of salt and desperation. Zoe felt her knees go weak as he dragged her body flush against his heat searing through the thin towel. He lowered her onto the silk sheets, his weight a heavy, grounding comfort. His hands explored her with a frantic hunger, as if he were memorizing her curves to ensure she was real. "Say it," he groaned against her skin, his lips moving to the hollow of her hip. "Say you're mine." "I'm yours," Zoe gasped, her fingers tangling in his dark hair, pulling him closer. The fear was still there, but it was being drowned out by a primal, overwhelming need for the man who had torn down gates to find her. In the quiet of the high-rise, under the watchful eye of the Seoul skyline, Kwan finally claimed what he had spent a lifetime searching for. He was a man of violence, but with her, his touch was a slow, agonizing worship. Zoe woke to the sound of a city she couldn't see. The blackout shutters were still down, keeping the world at bay. Beside her, the bed was empty, but the indentation in the pillow remained. She wrapped herself in a silk robe left at the foot of the bed and stepped into the living area. Kwan was there, standing at the kitchen island, a tablet in his hand and a cup of black coffee in the other. He was dressed in a fresh suit, the warrior replaced by the businessman. "Eat," he said, gesturing to a spread of fruit, pastries, and eggs. Did you hear from Simeon?" she asked quietly. Kwan's expression flattened. "Your brother is safe. I had my men intercept him before he reached William's house. He's currently at a safe house. He thinks you're at a high-end spa, recovering from the stress of the breakup." "You lied to him." "I protected him," Kwan corrected, stepping toward her. "If he knew the truth, he'd try to take you back. And I don't want to have to hurt your brother, Zoe. Don't make me choose between your family and keeping you here." The reality of her new life began to take shape. Kwan handed her a new phone, sleek, gold, and preloaded with only one contact. Him. "You can call your brother once a day. My men will monitor the line," he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a diamond-encrusted bracelet. He snapped it onto her wrist. The clasp required a specialized key. "It has a tracker," she realized, her voice trembling. "It has my mark," he countered. He pulled her into his arms, tucking her head under his chin. You are free to move about this penthouse. You have the gym, the cinema, the garden on the roof, but the elevator only moves for my thumbprint. He tilted her head back, his eyes searching hers for a hint of rebellion. I saved you from a cage, Zoe. Don't hate me because the new one is more comfortable. Is that what this is, a cage? Kwan leaned down, his lips brushing her ear. It's a sanctuary, because out there, William's father is looking for someone to blame for his son's disappearance. And I am the only thing standing between you and the wrath of a grieving, crooked cop. Simeon wasn't a fool. Safely tucked away in a luxury, safe house in the suburbs, he stared at his phone. Zoe had called, her voice sounding hollow, distant. She told him she was fine, that a friend of a friend was looking after her while the police handled William. But Simeon knew his sister. He knew the tremor in her voice when she was hiding a bruise, and he knew that friends didn't own secure lines and blacked-out transport. He waited until his guards, Kwan's men, were distracted by a shift change. He slipped out the back window, moving through the shadows he had learned to navigate growing up in the city. He didn't have a gun and he didn't have a plan, but he had a name he'd overheard the guards whisper. Kwan. He headed back toward the city, toward the one person who could tell him who really held his sister. A contact in the precinct who worked under Captain Miller, William's father. Captain Miller sat in his office, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and cigarettes. His son William was missing. The official report said kidnapping, but Miller knew the streets. He knew that when someone disappeared without a ransom note in this part of town, it was a message. His phone rang, it was an unlisted number. We found the SUV, Captain, a voice crackled. Scrapped, but the GPS logs show it was near the Kim estate before it went dark. Miller's eyes turned into slits. The Kims, the Korean syndicate, Kwan. He didn't care about the law anymore. His son was a monster, yes, but he was his monster. If Kwan had taken him because of that girl, Miller would burn the entire syndicate to the ground. He grabbed his service weapon and his badge. He didn't need a warrant for what he was about to do. Back at the penthouse, Kwan had arranged a dinner that looked like a scene from a movie. Crystal glasses, vintage wine, and a dress of deep emerald silk for Zoe. He sat at the head of the table, watching her eat with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. You're quiet tonight, Kwan remarked, swiping his thumb across a smudge of sauce on her lip. I feel like a ghost, Zoe said, setting her fork down. I have no life, Kwan, I have no job, no friends, no son, just you. Kwan leaned forward, his eyes flashing. Am I not enough? I have given you safety, I have given you luxury. I have removed every person who ever dared to make you cry. You removed my freedom, she snapped, standing up. Kwan was on his feet in a second, his chair skidding across the marble. He was around the table before she could blink, pinning her against the edge of the mahogany. Freedom is a lie, Zoe. Out there you are a target. In here you are a goddess. Choose which one you want to be. The tension was broken by the sharp, rhythmic pulse of a red light on the wall. The security alarm. Kwan's face instantly shifted. The lover vanished, the dragon returned. He pulled a radio from his belt. Status. Sir, we have a breach in the lobby. It's Miller. He's brought half the precinct with him. They're claiming a missing persons warrant, but they're coming in hot, no sirens. Kwan looked at Zoe, his expression unreadable. He reached into his waistband and pulled out his secondary firearm, checking the chamber. Go to the panic room, he ordered. Kwan, what's happening? The law has come to collect a debt, he said, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the hidden door behind the bookshelf. And I don't pay debts, Zoe, I cancel them. The elevator dinked. The doors slid open to reveal Captain Miller, backed by 4 officers in tactical gear. They stepped into the penthouse, guns drawn. Kwan stood in the center of the room, his hands empty but his posture radiating a lethal calm. He had sent Zoe into the panic room, but she hadn't locked the door. She stood in the shadows, watching through the crack. Where is he, Kwan? Miller roared, his face flushed with rage. Where is my son? Your son is where all rot goes, Captain, Kwan said, his voice smooth as silk. Under the earth. Miller screamed in rage and leveled his gun. But before he could pull the trigger, the front door burst open again. Zoe, Simeon's voice echoed through the marble hall. He had followed Miller's unit, thinking they would lead him to his sister. The room exploded into chaos. Miller turned toward the new threat, his finger twitching on the trigger. Kwan lunged, not for Miller but toward the panic room door, protecting Zoe's line of sight. Simeon, run, Zoe screamed, breaking cover. The moment Zoe stepped out, the world slowed down. Captain Miller's eyes, bloodshot and crazed, shifted from Kwan to the girl who had ruined his son. He didn't see a victim, he saw a target. "You," Miller hissed, his gun swinging toward Zoe. Kwan didn't hesitate, he didn't shout. He moved with a speed that defied his size, throwing his body in front of Zoe just as the first shot cracked through the air. The bullet caught Kwan in the shoulder, spinning him around, but he didn't fall. He roared, drawing his own weapon and firing 2 precise shots into the tactical vests of the officers behind Miller. "Get down," Kwan shouted, shoving Zoe toward Simeon, who had crawled behind a marble kitchen island. The room dissolved into a deafening symphony of gunfire and shattering glass. The priceless vases and crystal chandeliers rained down in shimmering shards, a fitting end to the gilded cage. Kwan was bleeding, a dark stain spreading across his charcoal suit, but it only seemed to make him more lethal. He moved through the debris like a ghost, flanking the remaining officers. Miller was shouting, hiding behind a sofa, reloading with trembling hands. "You're dead, Kwan, you're all dead." Kwan appeared behind him, the barrel of his gun pressed against the back of Miller's skull. The remaining officers froze, their red laser sights dancing over Kwan's chest. "Tell them to drop the guns, Captain," Kwan whispered, his voice a low, terrifying rasp. "Or we find out if a bullet travels faster than a grieving father's prayers." "Drop them," Miller choked out, his bravado vanishing the moment he felt the cold steel of the syndicate. The officers hesitated, then lowered their weapons. They were cops, but they weren't suicidal. They knew that outside this penthouse, Kwan's men had already neutralized their backup. Simeon grabbed Zoe's arm, pulling her toward the exit. "Zoe, we have to go, now while they're distracted." Zoe looked at her brother, then at Kwan. Kwan was bleeding, his face pale, but his eyes were locked on her. Even with a gun to a police captain's head, his priority was her. "Go, Zoe," Kwan said, his voice surprisingly soft. "Go with your brother, you wanted your freedom, it's right there." Zoe took a step toward the elevator, her heart thudding. She looked at the diamond bracelet on her wrist, the tracker, the mark of the beast. Then she looked at the man who had burned his life down to keep her safe from a predator. "Simeon, wait," she whispered. "Zoe, what are you doing? He's a monster," Simeon yelled. "He's my monster," Zoe said, the realization hitting her with the force of a tidal wave. William had locked her in a house to hurt her. Kwan had locked her in a palace to worship her. Zoe didn't run, she walked back toward Kwan. Captain Miller saw his opening. In a desperate, final act of spite, he pulled a backup piece from his ankle holster. But he wasn't aiming at Kwan, he aimed at Zoe. Crack. The shot didn't come from Miller, it came from the doorway. Simeon stood there, holding a discarded service weapon he'd picked up from the floor. His hands were shaking, but his aim had been true. Miller slumped over, the life leaving his eyes before he could ruin one more thing. The silence that followed was heavy. Simeon dropped the gun, his face ghostly white. He had saved his sister, but he had entered a world he could never leave. "Clean this up," Kwan ordered his men as they flooded the room. He turned to Simeon. "You did well, you'll be on a plane to Switzerland tonight. You'll be taken care of for life, but you can never come back here." 3 weeks later. The new penthouse was even higher, even more secluded. The walls were reinforced steel and the windows were bulletproof. Zoe sat on the balcony, watching the sunset over the Han River. The door opened and Kwan walked out. His arm was in a sling, his face still bearing the faint scars of the night the law came for them. He walked up behind her, wrapping his good arm around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. "You're quiet," he murmured, his lips grazing her ear. "I was thinking about the neighbor's daughter," Zoe said. "I hope she's okay." "She is. I bought her family a new house in a better district. She'll want for nothing," Kwan said. He turned her around to face him. "And you, do you regret staying?" Zoe looked at the man who had claimed her soul. She knew she was a prisoner in a sense, she would always be watched, always be guarded. But in his arms she felt a power she had never known. Kwan led her inside, the lights dimming automatically. He pushed her gently onto the bed, his eyes dark with that familiar, burning obsession. "I almost lost you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He stripped off his shirt, the ink on his skin glowing in the moonlight. "I realized that night that I don't just want to own you, Zoe. I want to be the only thing you ever see." He moved over her, his touch possessive and demanding. There was no gentleness tonight, only the raw, visceral need of two people who had survived the dark. He claimed her over and over, his name a prayer on her lips. In the heat of their passion, the lines between rescuer and captor blurred until there was only the two of them, locked in a dance of shadows and light. The morning light broke over Seoul, but inside the fortress it was still twilight. Zoe laid her head on Kwan's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. The phone on the nightstand buzzed, a message from the underworld. The vacuum left by Captain Miller was being filled, new threats were rising. Kwan reached out and silenced the phone. For the first time in his life, the war could wait. He looked down at Zoe, his hand tangling in her hair, his gaze fierce and protective. "They will come for us," Zoe whispered. "Let them come," Kwan replied, his voice a promise of violence and devotion. "I've already killed for you. I'll burn the world down next if that's what it takes to keep you by my side." Zoe leaned up and kissed him, accepting the crown of thorns he offered. She wasn't the girl who had sent a frantic voice note anymore. She was the woman who had walked into the fire and found her home.